just to give you a little telegraph. So a little bit about myself. My name is Jeff Luszcz. I'm a VP at Flexera. You might have heard of a company called Palamida, and I'm the founder of Palamida back in 2003. We were one of the first companies doing open source license scanning, compliance, vulnerability detection, et cetera. So I've been working with companies for about 15 years on open source license discovery, management, remediation, M&A, baseline, kind of anything to do with the use of open source, building software, and things like that. If you have any questions about the talk today, please get in touch with me at my email address which is jluszcz@flexera, or on Twitter at Jeff Luszcz, and I always love hearing from people who went to the shows here. So, what we're going to, the classic, I'm not your lawyer, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not even your programmer, disclaimer here. We're going to talk about some licenses, we're going to talk about some best practices. If you really have questions about how your company is using licenses, please talk to your lawyer. They're either going to have an answer for you, or you're going to prompt them to get some training and education about the licenses you're using. So let's hop into it. We're going to do a 2-hour session today. The first half is going to be around governance and vulnerabilities and kind of some lessons learned in the field. The second half is going to be about remediation, some things that I've seen that have caused companies some pain and how they've handled that. And we'll also have some Q&A as time goes on. So a couple things I'd like to talk about today. First thing is just what are we seeing out there? What are we seeing in the use of open source? What are we seeing in the use of kind of the various licenses and how people are using that? We'll talk about some open source governance and licensing basics, as well as to get into some of the sticky wickets that people are finding themselves. So I think it's not a surprise to people here that open source is everywhere. My experience has been that the typical company's code base is at least 50% open source, and in some cases is 99% open source. And that's a big surprise for companies, and especially in the financial world where the traditional view is we write every single line of code ourselves. But now with the explosion of open source, and I think kind of the opening of people's eyes about what's actually being done, is we're seeing how much we're actually writing versus how much are puzzle pieces that we're wiring together. And that's not a problem. That's, we shouldn't be writing an XML parser. We shouldn't be writing a cryptographic library in the financial services world. We should be taking best of breed, wiring them together, and kind of using the benefit of the open source world. We also are consumers of other people's products. So it's not just the products that we're building, it's the products that we're depending on, the IT infrastructure, et cetera, that again is also primarily open source these days. And that's a great thing, but there's some risks and some challenges and some things that we need to do in order to better manage it. The other thing I think is really changing, and I think this is especially helpful for management, is that how we build software is changing. 15 years ago, 20 years ago, when a lot of the managers were learning how to write software for their technical folks, every single line of code was hand-carried, whether it was from a book, whether it was from a partner, whether it was from the developer themselves, hand-carried to the device, entered in source code management, and that's the way it went. You knew where every line of code came from, you knew where every package came from. If you needed to, you'd go look at your bookshelf at the tapes or CDs or DVDs of where third-party code came from, but we can't do that anymore. Right now, our developers have, first day on the job, we give them access to source code management system, we give them access to a search engine and the internet, and we might not even be giving them any education or training on copyright or patents or open source licensing. But we say, go be smart. Go write software for us. And the world has changed. So if we're looking right now in the modern software company, modern financial services company, we're not hand-carrying code line by line from a book or from the internet. We're not even just downloading things from FTP sites. We talk about GitHub and things like that. We click and download the zip file, but we're actually using a lot of things like package managers, which is, if you're not familiar with, is a system for basically carrying third-party libraries into your code base. It might not even be checked into your source code management system. These things at build time download open source from the internet and put it into your product and all its dependencies. Containers. It's interesting. A couple of years ago, a lot of people are saying, oh, we're not shipping software anymore. Everything's software as a service. Everything is on the web. But we've all seen the explosion of containers and Docker, where we're actually now shipping probably more Linux as companies than we've done in the generations ahead of time before us. And then maybe a little bit less important for the financial world, but the IoT world, the embedded world, is extremely, it's extremely common to see embedded systems, Linux systems, mostly open source in the IoT world. And obviously Linux is predominantly open source.
Sorry, IoT?
Internet of Things.
Okay.
So embedded devices, sensors, and things like that. So in the last year, people's eyes have really been open to the vulnerabilities that are present just in all software. People sometimes pick on open source software. I don't think open source software is a problem. It's all software has bugs, and we need to know what software we're using, what vulnerabilities are there. I think the open source vulnerabilities kind of get big press, primarily because that's open source one. We're using open source pretty much in every device, in every application. It is the underpinnings of everything that we use. And since it's ubiquitous, and it's something that hackers know is going to be there, they can use that as an attack vector because they know that OpenSSL is going to be on every device. They know that Struts 2 is going to be in pretty much every Java application that's exporting an interface. So these is why these are targets. I think the financial services industry had their eyes opened about a year ago in terms of how much open source was actually being used versus what kind of their gut feeling was telling them. And also it showed just that the management processes that were in place, and I think are still in place, were not sufficient in order to tell you what bill of materials of open source we're using, basically a list of things that we depend on, how old they are, what versions, and what vulnerabilities are there. And I'll talk a little bit more about this during the next 2 hours here on the session, but at the heart of it, I like using these libraries as good tests, basically thermometer reading of how our applications are and how our processes are. If you go back to your teams and you say, are we using OpenSSL? How many copies? Where do they come from? What are the versions? It's a great bellwether for how everything else is being run. Because we had the big Heartbleed vulnerability about 4 years ago. Everybody's eyes were open to OpenSSL and vulnerabilities. We did a lot of work in the industry to fix our act back then. My experience has shown that that was kind of a flash in the pan. Basically, everybody did a lot of work, but then we kind of left things alone. And we haven't gone back to keep those, in many places, update those versions, keep track of the vulnerabilities that have come out. Struts 2, which was generally recognized as safe. It was a great library, great permissive license. People didn't really keep track of it. The vulnerability came out and kind of caught the industry by surprise, and we've seen what happened there. So this is, those are individual items, and I think when we look here as the end builders of applications, we are depending on a software supply chain. And the software supply chain is becoming more complex. I talked a little bit more about those repository managers. We talked about how the code gets to you. But this is another really important thing. As you design your processes, as you design your kind of policies about what's allowed and what's not allowed, it's really important not just to have a feeling about what licenses are we using. Do we like the GPL? Do we like the Apache 2.0, et cetera? But also, how does code come into our company? We saw from the presentation just a little while ago about all the wires and all the instrumentation that people will look at and say, code is coming here and we're going to block code from going out that way. That is something that's really important, I think, for organizations to look at. How does code come in? Is it open source? Is it from other projects at our company? Is it partner code and commercial code? We always talk about open source, but when you come back and you say, how many partners do we depend on? How many commercial libraries and products do we depend on? Is often ignored by this process as well. What did we write? What did our developers write on their own time, and so on? Mix that all together. Each of these triangles represents a place where third-party code, whether it's open source or commercial, comes into our organization. Maybe for something that we use as tooling, maybe part of our product, maybe part of the IT infrastructure that our developers don't even care about, but is something where our product ends up running. All of these have things that we need to manage and discover. And so what do we see? So I've been helping companies for about 15 years. We have a lot of experience from people who say, come in and run a scan and tell us what we're actually using. Or we're about to buy a company, and they say they're only using X. Can you tell us what they're really using? And I have some data here that will be available in the slides afterward. But basically shows what's the size of a typical application in 2017, 2018. That's the blue bar. And the yellow bar represents what each engineering team was actually able to tell us what they thought they were using before scan or analysis was done. And basically what we see is this is on the order of a 25 times difference between what people think they really are using and what's actually going out the door. And this just shows the big disconnect, I think, between engineering management, engineers, the tooling that's available, and also I think the expectations for the company about what actually has to be done. And you'll see, going back about 5, 6 years here, is just how we're starting to see this ramp up. Part of this ramp up is the new technologies that are coming in. NPM, the kind of the JavaScript ecosystem that people are using a lot. We see this a lot in financial services. This has kind of changed the component counts from maybe 100 or 200 libraries to literally 2,000, 3,000 libraries in a single application. They're all very small pieces. The old Java world from 5 years ago, we'd have these huge monolithic pieces we'd bring in, maybe 100 of them. Now in the JavaScript world, we bring in these tiny little pieces that we wire together, but we have thousands of them, all from different authors, maybe primarily with a single license type, but we don't know until we do analysis or do a review. And I don't see this pace slowing down. If anything, I think we're going to see more things like NPM, where we see more and more smaller pieces being aggregated together. But I also haven't seen the industry really change in terms of how we're managing things. If you go back 5, 6 years, same type of count. We know about 24 components that we're using. Oh, we use MySQL. Oh, we use this. We use that. But they're not really catching the long tail and the big tail of everything that's there. A question in the back.
Did you find the same kind of ratios with different licenses? So in the disclosure of the 17, there might have been 5 types of licenses, but in the 590, there might have been 5.
Yeah, I think what we see is that the common license types, it's kind of mixed. Most people don't disclose GPL, even if they're using it. They're going to disclose kind of the well-known components. They might disclose OpenSSL because their customers ask for it. They might disclose their application servers like Tomcat or Python or NPM because it's a thing that's underpinning the whole application. But the vast majority of items they're just not paying attention to. The licenses that you can probably name off the top of your head are probably, you're going to see those licenses there. The Apache, the BST, the MIT. It also depends on what ecosystem you're in. If you're in automotive, you expect to see general public license, these strong, the licenses that are underneath Linux. If you're in finance, you probably don't expect to see general public license code there. So maybe it's going to be more toward Apache or Cuddle or MIT. And I'll talk about what some of those acronyms mean in a little bit here. So what do people disclose? They typically disclose their databases. They disclose their kind of network kind of infrastructure, their OpenSSLs, et cetera. But they kind of miss the main inventory, the core inventory, the 590 other items that are actually being used, but they're not talking about. So let's talk a little bit like the underpinnings of open source is the licensing. And I think it's really extremely important to understand the culture and the understanding of how we got to where we are. And I think we're also in the middle of a next shift in licensing. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But basically, we've always had open source. It might not have been called open source, but when back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, when you bought a device, it was basically the hardware dongle was this mainframe, and the source code came along for free. People didn't care about licensing as much, or it was just assumed like, well, I'm going to copy it for you, I'm going to give it to you the tape, etc. But in the 80s, we started to see, computer costs came down. The software itself became a differentiator between companies. We had what was called the Unix wars, where everybody had a Unix variant that they were trying to sell. And I think we started to have the beginnings of the network culture. We had the beginnings of the internet. We had ARPANET, et cetera. And we had, in the early 80s, freeware. Everybody had shareware, freeware, et cetera, things like that. Maybe not for commercial purposes, but in the consumer space. So people started to think about sharing code. They started to think about, maybe I pay for it, maybe I try before I buy it, et cetera. And then there was kind of a milestone in 1985. We had that first kind of classic open source license that we're still using to this day, relatively untouched, which was known as the MIT license or the X11 license. This is the same license that NPM uses for a lot of their modules. So written in 85, still modern, still being used, still important. And then very right after that, we had kind of a response to, again, the Unix wars and whatnot, which was the first general public license, which basically was a license. MIT basically says, give credit where credit's due. If you're using my code, if you're shipping my code, let people know that you're using something from me. Put my name in the about box of documentation. In 1988, the first general public license came out. And the idea there was, credit is not enough. I need to have access to the software, the source code itself. And that's where the free software movement came. When we talk about free software, it's really this culture of saying, I expect the code to be shared. If I get a product, if I get a device, if I get something, I should be able to hack it and change it and modify it and make it fit for my purposes. That may be different than the classic commercial world, which is I ship you something and I expect you not to hack it. I expect you not to change it. And it's interesting because those two licenses came out, and they're kind of the underpinnings of the open source world right now. We really see that's just kind of the heart of the two different types of movements that we see in open source. One is about giving credit, kind of preserving ownership and giving credit. The other is around sharing the technology. And rising tide raises all ships. If you found value in this, you should pass on your changes and your code as well so that we all get extra value. After that, there was a couple other licenses. The BSD license, which is very, very common, very similar to the MIT, really about giving credit. And then people found that there were some problems with the GPL. It was maybe seen as too strong. And we saw the LGPL come out back there in 1991. And with the LGPL, means the lesser general public license or the library general public license. It basically says is, you know what, we want people to build software with open source. We want the sharing of this core technology, but maybe we can leave some things proprietary. So if you're a commercial company and you build some product, but you happen to use a library that has the LGPL license, and you improve that library, expectation is you give those changes back to the community, to your customers, the community in general, but maybe it doesn't affect the other code that you wrote that's outside of that library. Again, that was a really important kind of cultural change in licensing, which says we want to share a lot of things, but maybe not everything that touches against it. And then the internet really exploded, and we saw the Affero license come out in 2002, and then with a refresh of all these licenses in 2007. And what the Affero license brought to the world is saying, we live in an internet world now. We don't distribute every product. I'm not giving you a tape or a DVD or a CD anymore. You're coming in through your web browser. And what the Affero license, and then the modified version, which was the Affero GPL that came out in 2007, basically said is, if you are providing a network service, and we can talk about the specifics of the legal terms of the AGPL or the Affero license, but basically if you're providing an internet service, and maybe you've made some modifications to the AGPL code behind the scenes, the expectation is that you're going to give the source code away to your internet users, the people coming in through the network. And we can spend a whole 2 hours talking about the AGPL and the GPL, but that's kind of the asterisk on that is kind of the general idea about what's going on behind the scenes there. And that was in 2007. I think that was kind of the last seismic shift we had in the open source world and licensing. And I feel like we're on the cusp of that next generation. We're starting to see people put out proposals for new licenses. We're starting to see some pressure in the commercial world saying, I don't want certain network access. I don't want certain companies taking my open source and providing that as a service and so on and so on. Maybe not finding that the AGPL is sufficient for that. So we start to see some things like the common clause, which was an additional term, which I wouldn't consider open source. So it's kind of a commercial restriction, but we're starting to see stuff like that put on. We start to see some patent clauses coming onto the licenses. And I wouldn't be surprised if over the next year or so, we start to see some pressure from large open source based companies who have a lot of value behind them, who are now having some battles over what is expected from an open source and commercial world. I don't quite know where that's going from right now, but I think that's something a lot of our clients are paying attention to, which is we're using open source, we're especially using open source that is backed by large unicorn billion-dollar companies. That open source is sometimes seen as maybe a different culture than the classic philosophical open source where I'm writing something because I want the whole world to have it, I don't have a company behind it, et cetera. So kind of watch this space, but I know a lot of the folks who are paying attention, especially in the database space, we're paying a lot of attention to what might be coming down the line in terms of license changes. So at the heart of it, open source is around obligations. Back in the 80s, if I wanted to use your code, I would call you literally up on the phone and say, can I use your code? Oh, it'll cost you this money. Or, yeah, of course you can. I'll send you the tape. I'll send you the latest updates. The idea behind open source license is we don't want to have a personal one-on-one phone call to get permission to use your code. I can write down in my license basically a set of expectations and obligations, and you as an open source user will say, of course, yes, I can do this, I can do this. Oh, I can't do that? Well, I can't use this library, can't use this license. I'll go look someplace else. So it's really important for us to understand the obligations, and I think as an industry, we've not done a really good job in terms of actually following up on the obligations. If you go look at the typical software company and you say, are we using open source? Yes. Are we tracking it all? No. Does our about box have all the things that the licenses tell us that are supposed to be there? Most companies, I would say no. Are we using certain libraries that expect us to pass along that source code, kind of that shared source? Most companies are not doing that. Are we marking things properly? No. We're kind of using it, but we're not following these obligations. And I think we're starting to see some more pressure in terms of the open source world themselves to say it's a two-way street. We gave this to you, kind of out of the goodness of our hearts, but we're not doing the right thing. And part of that is tooling. I think it's very difficult. It can be difficult for people to discover and track and then comply with these obligations. A lot of this comes from management expectations. If we all have software teams reporting to us and we don't give them space on their roadmap to comply with open source licensing, you get what you measure. And so we should, on our roadmaps, have explicit open source compliance. We should have the obligation management. We should make sure that's built in part of our process and our engineers understand what's expected of them. And I think at the heart of it, we should be using the libraries that use the licenses that we're able to comply with. And if we're using libraries that have licenses that we can't comply with, don't use them or remove them, remediate them. At the heart of it, this is what we call open source compliance or OSS compliance. There's some commonly seen obligations that are out there. I think at the heart of it, we saw those two philosophies before, kind of the give credit where credit's due, and the other one is to share the source code so that we all benefit from that shared resource. Those are kind of the two philosophies out there. There's many, many other obligations that we'll see, even in those existing licenses. There's some, in some cases, some patent obligations and patent restrictions. So if you are an organization that has a lot of patents or expect that you're going to be patenting certain things and enforcing your patents, you should be paying attention to the patent aspects of the licenses or the culture of what you're using. And I'll talk a little bit about that in the second half around some of the places we see that, but typically around multimedia, so audio, video is most common places. There may be some restrictions on use. And so I think one of the issues that we have here is everybody talks about open source. Open source has actually a very specific definition. So is it free software? Is it open source? Is it visible source? So some of these things might actually be restrictions that somebody in the open source world will say, oh, that's not open source. Like something that restricts use is technically not open source. But I think we have a somewhat lack of terms to kind of mention this third-party software. I like saying open source and third-party software. It'd be nice if we had a term that kind of covered all of that. But in general, it's basically code we didn't write that came from the outside. But restrictions on use is very common to see. We see a lot of things that say, not for commercial use. And that's not open source. And probably most of us, we paid for a conference today, we're probably commercial users, or many of us are commercial users. So we can define, is this commercial use or not commercial use? I kind of fall on the side of if it says not for commercial use, we probably shouldn't be using it in general. You may be able to negotiate that with that author, but there's usually a reason. They're concerned about getting sued. They're concerned about liability are the two most typical reasons why somebody will mark their code not for commercial use. We'll also see some other restrictions. If you're using certain Java examples that come from Sun or Oracle, they'll explicitly say not for avionics use, not for use in a nuclear power plant. Those are some pretty serious restrictions, and I am sure there's design and running of nuclear power plant code right now that's being based on that code, even though it explicitly says not for that use. So understanding your use, if you're in the military, if you're in certain organizations that may be doing certain things politically, you always want to pay attention to those restrictions of use. There's going to be these vanity and one-off licenses, and I'll show an example in just a little bit here, but these cause the most legal annoyance. They're like 1 out of 1,000 libraries you're going to use, but everybody then sits here and is debating about, are we doing, why did we pick this library? We're now going to spend thousands of dollars of legal time analyzing something that probably is a one-off throwaway library. So we'll talk about that. But basically, these are not the classic licenses. They're not the names that you see. It's not MIT, GPL, Affero. It's somebody just wrote something that looks like a license that then has to be interpreted. The attribution, the disclaimers, the preserve and pass on the license text, and then lastly, classic commercial terms. So it's obviously not open source, but the commercial world has had to modify how they do licensing because of what open source has done. So we start to see more free code that's out there that's still commercially licensed. It's still commercial terms, but maybe it's not a click. Maybe it's a click-through. Maybe it's just you don't even have to click through. It's not, you don't have to pay, but there's going to be things like don't use this for this type of service, or allowed only on this type of operating system, not that operating system. So these are the commonly seen obligations. Most developers, I think, do not have the knowledge of this. They might have some simple policy. We use this license. We don't use this license. When you get into obligation management, This is something I think does not currently have an owner in most companies. Legal kind of thinks engineering is going to do it. Engineering thinks that there must be a lawyer somewhere in the organizations that's handling all these things, and it's kind of this orphan. So we've talked about the two common license philosophies here. There's a couple examples of some licenses here. So that copyleft is that idea of we're going to share that source code. You sometimes will hear people say viral. I don't like that term, but you'll hear that term out there, and the idea is that this code infects other code with those terms. I just put it out there so you know that term. I don't like it, but general public license is the most common one. You'll also see the lesser or the library general public license, the FARO. And those are strong and weak. So some is the whole product has to be given away if you distribute it. The weak is just this section, this library. And you'll see some other licenses that have those terms, like the Mozilla license, the CUDL, the CDDL license. Very commonly used, very business friendly, but I kind of have these what we call weak copyleft. If you make some modifications, you're expected to pass those along. And then the permissive, which I think many companies really prefer the permissive licenses, the BSD, the MIT, the Apache software licenses, 1.1, 2.0, et cetera. There's a long tail of other licenses as well that are seen as permissive. There will be some discussion and debate. Is it permissive? Is it academic? Is it attribution licenses? I think in general we don't have to have an argument about what we call it. I think the general idea is, we need to give credit where credit's due. We need to preserve these attributions and these notices. And you'll see different cultures. It's like the Linux world is more this culture of the top type of license. The web world is going to be perhaps more of this culture of the bottom type of licenses. And what you see now, like in the financial services world, we're dealing with containers, we're dealing with hosting operating systems. We're going to have half of our world, like our IT infrastructure, is really going to be this style license. And the applications we write are really going to be this style of license. And we have IT team dealing with this, development team dealing with this, but then running their software on top of those types of licenses. It's really important for us to understand how these licenses work together and how these two cultures might clash. I told you I'd give you a couple examples of some vanity licenses. My favorite is the free beer license, which almost certainly you guys are using somewhere in your applications right now. Basically says, as long as you retain this notice, you can do whatever you want with this stuff. If we meet someday and you think this stuff is worth it, you can buy me a beer in return. So this is a great license. If you go look at your phone right now, you might be able to find this in some of the about boxes and the applications you're using. We also see the good, not evil. This software shall be used for good, not evil. Classic vanity license. I can't tell you how many legal hours have been spent arguing about this. And that's just something we see is every code base is going to have a couple of these almost joke licenses or funny licenses that brings humor into the engineering world. But the legal world really doesn't like to interpret humor. And this is, if we can, like you can't get away from the JSON license. If you were using JSON as a file format, almost certainly you're going to have this license somewhere in your code base. Is this there? There's some other licenses I don't put up here that have swear words in their name and in the license text, and we all know, perhaps you'll know it when you see it. That's the type of thing you sometimes will see as part of major libraries, but then when it comes to disclosure or compliance, and you're sitting here in a room and people are saying, I can't even read this license name, not always the most professional thing to see, and it can cause some compliance issues, because are we going to disclose this to our customers? Should we use this? We've already built it, we've already shipped it, now you have that issue. So the vanity license, I think, are kind of, their annoyance kind of outweighs their utility into the code base, but almost certainly you're going to see these and you deal with these. So why do you need it? I always like having this slide because I can't tell you how many people come to me and say, my developers tell me we can do anything we want. We can do X, Y, Z, or we don't have to follow this because of copyright law, blah, 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 blah. There will be these arguments, I think, in some companies about copyright law and patent law and all that. And I think at the heart of it is just as an organization, copyright law exists. Wherever you are in the world, you're going to have different copyright laws. But at the heart of it, that is what underpins open source and the open source licenses. And as a company, we're not going to fight copyright. Maybe we'll, in some cases, we might have a legitimate reason. But if we're using open source, we have to follow the law. We have to follow the licenses. We may interpret them one way or another, but we shouldn't be having arguments with our developers about copyright law, et cetera. Yes?
Just out of interest, is there a legal view on dual licensing? So we always go for the most permissive. Is there actually guidance on if there's two licenses?
So I'm not a lawyer, so I don't want to argue about one way. But I think at the heart of it is, as a copyright owner, you pretty much are able to put whatever terms you want on, within the realm of copyright. And so dual license is seen, I think, as perfectly permissible. And if you say, if you want it under this, if you do this thing, you can use it under this license. If you want it under this license, you can use that. And in the second half, I'll talk more about dual licensing as well. But I've never seen anybody really fight against dual licensing from a copyright perspective. So I think the sooner we can, I've seen a lot of legal ink and a lot of time and emails internally in companies arguing about, is copyright law and licensing even in effect? And I think the sooner you can kind of shut down that discussion, the better, because it just never seems to go anywhere fruitful. But the kind of the flip side of this is, if you don't have an open source license, you really don't have permission to use somebody else's code. And we can put a little asterisk on fair use and all that, but I think as a commercial company, I've never really seen a case where people have been very happy to go out and use somebody else's code without an explicit license. We want certainty. We want permission, especially if we're going to be shipping 1 billion copies of something, or if we're going to be hosting $1 billion worth of financial services in it. So one thing here is, what does compliance look like? I think people are still looking for good models of compliance, and I'll show a couple examples in a couple slides here. But the general idea is, what open source are we using? What are those obligations? What's our internal policy on that? And then what are the visible indicators of compliance? How do our users, how do our customers know where to go to say, we know what open source they're using, they're following all the obligations, et cetera, et cetera. So here's a kind of a laundry list of places where your customers are going to be looking for compliance, and maybe your open source authors will be. So copyrights in your about box is a very common thing. If you have your phone, pretty much any phone, if you go to general about or general legal, you're going to see a list of licenses there. My gut feel tells me that UI, that dialog box, is not large enough to actually hold all the licenses that are in the phone there. But it's a good example. The documentation that you pass on. Many of the open source licenses actually will say that you have to pass along in the documentation, or that's one way. You have to pass the license text, and that should be the actual license text. I've seen a lot of companies kind of hack that or not quite do that, or even the open source projects don't do a good job. They say, we're licensed under the MIT, but they actually never give you the license text of the license that they say that they're under. So these are the things where both the open source world and the commercial world still has a lot to go in terms of kind of cleaning up their act and making it very clear to users. If you're using GPL and LGPL and you're shipping that to your customers as a mobile app or a container, you have to preserve that source code and pass it along either at delivery time or give a written offer. And I think many people that you'll talk to say it's best to do it right the first time. You don't want to have to scramble after the fact to try to find the exact source code that you shipped. And some of the biggest kind of LGPL and GPL issues that I've seen out there, especially with the handset manufacturers of phones, has been arguing about specific versions. Oh, we released version 101 of the source code, and the community says, no, you're actually using 101B, and that's not the right source code, and they have to keep going back to the well to deliver that. We'll talk a little bit about like web service SLAs and commercial licenses, et cetera, but the heart of it is you're using a lot of other people's stuff, and you need to know what the terms are there. And you need to do compliance on every release. I see a lot of companies, if they're doing compliance at all, it's once a year, or it's once a major release, or it's when a major customer tells them that they need to, and they scramble to do that. I think the hope here is of tooling and culture and compliance is that we make this like breathing. If I make a release, if I'm using my continuous integration system, the hope is that we can deliver all of this as part of that. I think that's still a ways out. Yeah.
Any pushback from our regulators yet? I've never seen that.
You know, I don't think they even realize that this is out there. I think they're starting to see. I think Equifax and Struts, it's opened them. I've done a very similar talk with the inside auditor groups, and they're starting to, they're scribbling at the right points, which tells me that a couple of years from now, we're going to start seeing that guidance coming in from the inside auditors around open source. It's already there, but I think it's at a very aspirational, you should do the right thing, as opposed to you must do, you shall do this, et cetera, et cetera. We do see this in like the company reports every year. We'll see a kind of blurb that says we depend on open source, one paragraph, and that may affect, may have risks and obligations, that may affect value. But that's all I've seen currently. I think it will be coming. We've seen.
Can I ask a question on the previous slide?
Yes.
Regarding compliance compliance is if you pay for commercial libraries.
Yeah.
What happens with donatorware? Where you expect to make a donation. As a corporate, do you pay? Do you not pay?
I have seen companies in general, if they can, if it looks like there's something that should be donation away, they're going to treat that as commercial, and they pay and they preserve that email thread or that payment thread, and they put it in the right place. Sometimes people actually will check in that email into the code base itself. Other people just preserve that as part of the legal, legal documents. Okay.
I think the interesting element around that is when you start looking at the companies behind the charity they're donating to, and actually where are you putting that money? Right?
Yeah, yeah.
It can come with a lot of corporate potential damage.
Yeah.
Damage.
Yeah, yeah.
Liability comes, as soon as you pay someone, liability is all over it.
Yeah. And we'll talk a little bit more about the commercial world, but in general, you see classic commercial, you see click-throughs, and then you see quasi-commercial, donationware, et cetera, where the question is it worth us paying, the 25 quid, should we just go try to find an open source library instead and not have to worry about the payment and the updates and things like that in a commercial relationship? You asked before about kind of the auditors and whatnot. I am seeing in like healthcare, and the FDA in the United States is putting out like kind of a notice of rulemaking, saying they expect to see a software bill of materials for every device. So it's not required yet, but they're telegraphing this is coming. Yes, Michael.
I was just going to say there are some organizations that do go sort of enforce compliance. The Software Conservancy is one, and there is a movement in Europe to enforce EPL in certain cases.
Yep. And I think that's always, it's good to understand the culture and the potential people who are doing enforcement actions and things like that. I think at the heart of it, we should be doing compliance for compliance sake, but there are sometimes reasons you can go back to your organizations and say, see, this helps us. So Michael in the back.
Yeah, I would like to add to that. It's not only the FDA in the US, but also in Germany, there's a new regulation for running critical infrastructures like energy, power distribution. And they ask also, for the reason of providing vulnerabilities or understanding vulnerability impact, they're asking also for the software bill of material when you run these applications. So it comes more and more that this is actually an obligation to uncover what
I fully agree, and I think we should expect it coming.
That's also in the UK, by the way.
is it? Yeah, I think it's a new regulation, but I didn't remember properly. The German implementation of it is called.
Yeah, it's to do with what they call critical utility infrastructure. You'll see it all in that part of it. Okay.
Yep. And it's I think it's one of the things. It's out of the bag. It's coming, and we should expect for it. And especially if you're in those, I think finance, I think healthcare, energy, transportation, power, oil, gas. Those are all organizations that we should really expect that if we don't do a good job, we're going to be told what to do. And I think most people don't like being told what to do.
And the military.
And the military, exactly.